Good morning. Let's go ahead and have a seat. Let me start with a little announcement in case this may have already been announced, but this was found here. Mrs. Arbuckle, Mr. Arbuckle's one. Okay. All right. Welcome. We're so glad that you're here, and looks like we have a lot of returning parents. Let's just kind of see who we have here. So if you are a returning parent from last year or before, would you stand up so we can see who we have here? Hey, welcome back. Good. And you can see, so I had you stand, so now you can see who all the new people are, and y'all can be the greeters and welcome them. Okay, so we're going to just jump right into this. So this is sort of a keynote in a way, which feels really odd to be called a keynote speaker when I'm here all the time. But anyway, this is about classical education, and I am so thankful to see you who have been with us for several years, to see that you took the time to come out today. I appreciate that, and what it tells me is that you have this learning, that you're a lifelong learner, and you desire to learn more. It would be so easy for us to say, well, gosh, I've been a part of a classical school. I've been part of Veritas for 6, 7, 8 years. I know what classical is. It would be easy to say that. Well, Troy and I and Ellen and Jeff and the teachers, we have felt like that we just need to dive deeper into classical to truly understand it. We are, Veritas Academy, a classical university model school, classical Christian university model school. We understand the Christian part. We understand the university model part because that is our structure and that is how we live. We go to school here a few days and we're home a few days. But that classical part, that's a part that's a little bit harder to define. And yet it is a key component to who we are. If we take out the classical part of Veritas, we are not Veritas anymore. So we realize that we really need to impart more of what classical is. We started in the spring, and we asked our leaders, our department heads, at a meeting, we said, how many of you knew about classical education before you came to Veritas? And I think there might have been one, maybe two people there in a group of 20. So their only exposure to classical education had come through us. And as leaders, Troy and I realized that we have not spent as much time as we should have really understanding classical. And if that is the case for our leaders, our teachers, then we know it has to be the case for our parents. So we want you to really understand classical. So we're kicking it off today, helping you to understand what that is. We'll be doing more classes through the entire year. That is our book study for our teachers. We want to invite you to be a part of that as well. So please, we hope that today kind of just whets your appetite. I want to tell you that I felt like I understood classical education, but every year, especially in the summer, I dive into more books, I go to more workshops, and I find out that I only know a little bit about it. And every summer when I dive further into it, I think, why did I not already know that? So we can always learn more. So let's just dive right into this. Classical education, I don't know if you can read that or not. Maybe you can see it on your handout. But these are some buzzwords that come to mind when you think of classical education. You might think of grammar, logic, and rhetoric. We talk about those as part of our school. You might think of rigorous, Christian, what are some others? Well-rounded, analytical thinking, passion, Latin, art, great books. Those buzzwords might come to mind. But when I challenge a teacher, when I challenge myself to define what classical education is, it is really, really hard to come up with a concise description or definition of what classical is. So let me just, especially for those of you who know what classical is, I'm going to give you about 10, 20 seconds to think about that for a minute. How would you define to someone what classical education is? Someone have a perfect definition? You know, it's funny, when we go to the Society for Classical Learning, that conference in the summer, even these great philosophers, these people who really do more, well, I say they do nothing more than study classical. I'm sure they have a life. They are so smart. We just want to sit at their feet and just learn from them. But even they are struggling with that. How do you really define classical? So I've kind of stolen some of their ideas, and I've come up with a simple definition, I hope. So let's go ahead and move to the next slide. I think that classical education can be defined simply as wisdom and virtue. wisdom and virtue. Now, where do we come up with that simple definition? This is really just the two main components, wisdom and virtue. Well, it comes from the Iliad, which is the text that the Greeks really considered to be their greatest literary work. And in the Iliad, there's a passage in there where Phoenix is speaking to Achilles at a point of crisis in his life. And Phoenix says to Achilles, "Your father sent me with you to train you in all excellence of speech and action." Now, I want you, if you have a handout, circle that, speech and action. I'm going to extend that idea of speech to thinking. When we are speaking, we're really just conveying what we're thinking. So Phoenix said that he was commanded to teach Achilles and how to speak or how to think. Yes? Yep. I do have handouts. Did y'all get handouts? Okay, some more are coming. Okay, sorry. Okay, so let's think about that. To train him or to train our children in how to speak and how to think and to train them in action. So the excellence of speech or thinking is really wisdom, because that's just the presentation of our accumulated knowledge, right? Wisdom. And then action, that part of action is really virtue. How do you present yourself? Who are you in the dark? That's the virtue part of it. So wisdom and virtue are our two main components right here. And I'm going to share with you how we teach those in a classical school. What means do we go about using for to reach this wisdom and virtue? So the next slide, please. So you're right. Okay, so wisdom, we go about that through the 7 liberal arts. Now, you probably heard a little bit about this, but the 7 liberal arts are just the branches of knowledge that were defined by the ancient Greeks that really comprised their educational curriculum in the West during the Middle Ages. And you can see those listed here as grammar, logic, rhetoric, which really are what we call the trivium. That means 3 ways, grammar, logic, and rhetoric. That's where we're going to really focus today. But you see there are 4 other liberal arts, and those are arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, which is called the quadrivium, more of the subjects that they encounter once they have these 3, the trivium, grammar, logic, and rhetoric. But we'll focus right there on those first 3. Now, if you've been with Veritas for a while, you understand grammar, logic, and rhetoric as stages. If you've read Dorothy Sayers' essay, The Lost Tools of Learning, she defines grammar, logic, and rhetoric as stages that match the maturation of a child. So she says at the early stages, they're in that grammar stage of accumulating knowledge and then move into logic and rhetoric. We're going to continue to use grammar, logic, and rhetoric in terms of stages, but we're going to go further and we're going to use them as the tools of learning. So if you've been with us for a while, hang on, because I'm hoping to give you a little bit more than what you've had in the past, that we can see these as tools of learning. So first of all, these first 3 are linguistic tools. They're linguistic tools, and the other 4, the quadrivium, are more quantitative or mathematical skills. Okay, so we're using the 7 liberal arts to teach wisdom, and I'll show you how we do that. But other characteristics that are a part of this wisdom, the part of the liberal arts, it's language-based. We do a lot with text, a lot of written work, rather than just putting flashcards in front of them or screens in front of them. We want them to actually read. We want them to use a language because that requires them to be more active than passive. This, of course, demands self-discipline. You have to work hard to convert this text into meaning. And then we teach Latin, of course, here too as well, and the inflected language. And we do have some classes this afternoon about Latin if you're interested in those. So let's dig into that first of the liberal arts, grammar. So again, we're headed towards virtue through the liberal arts. We're starting with grammar. So what is grammar? What is grammar as a stage? What is grammar as a tool? Well, I want you to circle a word there that you see, accumulation. That grammar stage or that grammar tool is the accumulation of knowledge, or it could be the study of the structure of language. So at this stage, we're accumulating knowledge. At this stage, children are sponges. They absorb everything. If you have little kids from toddler age to about 4th grade or so, they are sponges. They see something on TV, a little commercial, and they have absorbed it quickly, haven't they? And they will repeat it. They hear you say something, and what do? They repeat it. That's great. We want to use that so that they can learn from that, using that tool. So our major goal here, what I'm trying to do is for every stage give you a characteristic and a major goal. Our major goal here is for students to build patterns through that accumulation of knowledge. At this stage, they need to understand the world. They haven't been around long enough to really understand the patterns of the world, so they are seeking it out, trying to figure out, how does this world work? How do they do this? Let's think for a second what this could look like. So the other day, I shared about this. I had a little girl in my office during an interview, and it must have been in 30 minutes, she kept telling me, this is March or April, she said, my birthday's in October. My birthday's in October. My birthday's in October. So what was she trying to convey to me? Kind of who she was. That was really important to her. But you can also see she has no idea that it's March and that she's thinking her birthday could come tomorrow, right? Do you have little ones that in March they say, when's Christmas? And you say, oh, honey, it's a ways away. So then in May, is Christmas here soon? Oh, no, honey, it's May right now. December is when Christmas is. So July, is Christmas coming soon? You see, they haven't lived long enough to know that pattern. They haven't established the pattern. So that's what our job here is, to give them information. We want to present information not just in sheer amount of volume, but we want to present that so they learn how to find information. They start learning how to fit it together a little bit, and they start absorbing that, just absorbing it through you retelling, them retelling, through memorization. The two key skills that we're trying to teach right here by presenting information to them are observation and concentration. We want to lay out a feast of information, not overkill, but we want to lay out a feast of information so they can learn to observe. So that could be that we go outside and we do a nature study. So we teach them how to observe a flower, to really look at it. Or it could be in grammar that we teach them how to really observe how a sentence has a capital at the beginning and a period at the end. Or how a sentence has a certain pattern. In science, of course, you're observing what happens when you do some kind of science experiment. You're getting them to build their ability to concentrate as well. So those are our main skills that we're really developing right there. And why are we doing this? Why are we presenting this feast of information to them at this age? That's because we want them to have knowledge, and we want to create these pegs in their head upon which they can hang information later. Now, they're not going to understand everything that you present to them, but they're going to create these little pegs. So let's see how this could work for you. So if you're close to my age, or I don't know how long this went, but hopefully you'll remember this. So back when I was a little girl, on Saturday mornings, I would watch the cartoons. And in between cartoons, there were these cute little jingles that would come on, and one was conjunction junction. See, you still remember that. I mean, for me, like 40 years later, I still remember conjunction junction, what's your function? Well, I'm 7 years old or 8 years old, and I'm watching that little jingle, this cute little train going across and how they connect. It means nothing to me, but I think it's pretty catchy, and I can memorize that. But see, I didn't know what that was until I was probably like in 7th grade or 8th grade. I remember Mrs. Brooks in 7th grade told us about conjunctions. And all of a sudden, I see a train. Well, oh, that's what it was, conjunction junction. They connect. I get it. But you see, I had that peg that was in my head. And what was that created through? That was created through jingles or through chants, right? And then I could hang that information on later. So that's what we're trying to do at this grammar stage. The tool of grammar is just to accumulate that knowledge and create those pegs through memorization. During that time, we also studied Latin. In fact, years ago, that's how they studied language, is through Latin, because Latin teaches that study of structure of language. And it helps students to build patterns. And it's difficult. It teaches them to concentrate and to observe. And then at those higher levels, we start digging into Latin and really understand the logic of it. So anyway, we'll talk more about that later. But let's move into that next part of the trivium, which is logic. Now, on grammar, I had you circle the word accumulation. On this one, I want you to circle the word evaluation. This is our focus for logic, evaluation. We want them to evaluate information. It's really the time to study thought. Now, what does this look like for kids who are at that stage? Maybe 5th grade through 8th grade, somewhere around there. What do they look like? Well, they are those ones asking why. Why does that happen? This doesn't make sense to me. Why? They want to understand. You see, they have already gone through grammar stage, and they have already accumulated a lot of information. They are starting to build patterns. Now they need to make sense of these patterns. They need to compare and contrast this. They're at a stage in their life where things are kind of topsy-turvy. Some strange things are happening to their bodies. Lots of things are changing with their friendships. They need to make sense of why all this is happening. They need a plan to deal with the unexpected. So our principle here is that we want to dig deeper. We want to hear what they're thinking and what they are internalizing. So our main goal here is to help them evaluate, and our principle is to dig deeper into discussions. Now, I've told parents before, when your kids get into 5th and 6th grade and you are sitting beside them, maybe reading history with them or science with them, if you enjoy that, do not just ask them what happened. If you're reading literature, don't just ask them to regurgitate the information. That's easy. They can tell you what the character setting and plot is. They can tell you what's happening in that history text. I want you to dig deeper. Why is this happening? Can you compare this event to that event? What do you think motivated them? So this is a time where you want to dig deeper with them. And the tools we're using here are evaluation and analysis. Now, I want to pause here for a second and just encourage you, because our little ones who magically go into 5th grade, they all go in about the same time, they're not all going to magically shift into logic at the same stage. Some kids kind of hit that logic stage or ability earlier on, maybe 3rd, 4th grade, they're using some logic. But others, it may not kick into gear till they're in 6th or 7th grade. And that's why algebra is sort of hard for some kids. That's why we create sort of a different track for math too, because not all kids will get to that logical understanding of math, which is algebra, at the same stage. So we want to respect them as individuals, kind of a Charlotte Mason principle. I also want to pause here and clarify something. I talk about grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and I talk about them as stages, but remember, I'm encouraging you to see them as tools as well. We all use grammar every day. If we have something new, we're going to have to accumulate the knowledge. We got a new phone, we're going to have to accumulate the knowledge of what all these little buttons are. Then we have to go through the logic of understanding it, and then we have to go through the rhetoric of really expressing ourselves, which we'll get to in a minute. But when I talk about grammar, logic, and rhetoric, when they're little, in those lower grades, 1st through 4th grade, we're focusing mostly on grammar. But that is not to say that kids don't use some logic and they don't use some rhetoric. They have to use those tools as well, but just not as much. So at this logic stage here, we didn't forget grammar. So in 6th or 7th grade, if they go into an earth science class or whatever class they're going into, we're not going to forget grammar. We're going to teach the grammar of that subject, but then we're going to focus on the logic as well. Does that make sense? Okay, let's move on to rhetoric. So rhetoric being that 3rd part of the 7 liberal arts. And our key word here for you to circle is expression. So we had accumulation, evaluation. Now we're at the point of expression. That's the art of persuasion. And what do kids look like here? These are our high school kids, for the most part, 9th through 12th grade. And what is important to them? Self-expression. They want you to know who they are, don't they? This is who I am. They're trying to figure out who they are, but they certainly want you to know that. And if you look at our culture, you can see that expressed in outward ways. Often you see it through body piercings, through the color of hair, tattoos, whatever it is, they're trying to express themselves. And we want to teach our kids how to express themselves in a way other than just the external, right? So I love this text, or this passage from Aristotle, and it was from the book Rhetoric, his classic text on this. He says, to a certain extent, the next slide, please. To a certain extent, all men attempt to discuss statements and to maintain them, to defend themselves and to attack others. Ordinary people do this either at random or through practice and from acquired habit. Now, the study of rhetoric is designed to make success in speech a matter of skill and practice, not just accident. Here's another quote by Aristotle. He said, it's absurd to hold that a man should be ashamed of an inability to defend himself with his limbs, but not ashamed of an inability to defend himself with speech and reason. For the use of rational speech is more distinctive of a human being than the use of his limbs. Isn't that what you want of your teenagers? Don't you want them to be able to defend, to express who they are verbally, especially as Christians? So our principal tool here is that we are idea-centered. Now remember back in grammar, that grammar stage, we were presenting a feast of information. At the logic stage, we were really trying to get them to analyze, to dig deeper. Now we want them to explore great ideas. So we're asking them questions about what is virtue? What is justice? What is truth? We're digging into their literature, and we're seeing how these characters handle these major ideas. We're using examples and non-examples. In history, we're looking at that as well. So we want these students to be actively engaged with ideas of the past and the present. Some tools that we use for this are what we call Socratic dialogue or Harkness discussions. And I'm hoping that you will take an opportunity this year as we provide it for you to be able to either sit under the instruction of one of our School of Rhetoric teachers. We're going to provide some opportunities, and you'll hear more about that later, or to come to some of the presentations that they're going to give at breakout sessions through the year. But you will see that our high school kids, our School of Rhetoric kids, they learn through discussion. So they're not all sitting in an individual desk looking at the teacher. They're sitting around a round table, an oval table, so they can see each other, and they are discussing these ideas in what we call Harkness discussion. And often they are leading the discussion, not the teacher. We're trying to get at these ideas and have them express their own ideas. So the skills that we talked about in classical education, remember, we're going back to our definition. I don't know if I have it on the slide or not. Going back to our definition of training in all excellence of speech and action, so wisdom and virtue. So in that trivium, it's teaching us how to speak or how to think. So we're going to accumulate, evaluate, and express through grammar, logic, and rhetoric. And we use all of our subjects through this pursuit of knowledge. So I wanted you to understand that wisdom part is obtained through what we're doing here at Veritas, going through that grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and using those tools in our classes. So let's move on to the virtue part. Again, our definition, this part is about the action part, and that is the virtue part. It teaches the content side of education in a way. That wisdom part, we do get some content, but we're getting the skills there of how to do this. Now we're really getting to the heart. We want to get to the content of what's happening here. And again, it's language-based. It is history-driven. We do a lot of reading of literature. We do a lot of history. History is kind of the guiding, the sort of the spine of classical education. We start with the beginning of time, and we are systematic in how we go through the presentation of history. We don't just teach American history year after year after year. We start with creation, and we go through ancient, we go through medieval times, the Renaissance, and on into the modern times. So it's very systematic, and all of our instruction hinges off of that chronological progression of history. Okay, let's talk about how we go to virtue. We do this through the integration of literature and history, but it's done through the great books. How many of you have heard of that, capital letters, the great books? Okay, the great books. Sometimes you hear about those in reference to Mortimer Adler. I believe it's back maybe in the 40s. He, with another editor, produced the set of the great books. I think it was published through Britannica. We actually have a set here at Veritas, too, if you're ever interested in seeing that or reading some of that. But it's basically the classic texts, those texts that have existed through the ages that are worth reading. And I think we have gotten away from that in America. It used to be that even the founding fathers of our country, they read these great books, and their education was not sitting in a classroom. Their education was reading these great texts and discussing these great texts and writing about these great texts. There was no fancy curriculum. They simply read these, discussed them, and wrote about them. But yet we, in the past few years, have really put those away, and we've missed out on a lot of those. So I want to talk to you about that. We use these. In fact, all of our literature for a School of Rhetoric is drawn from the great books, which is from the Western canon. So the great books, there are so many of them, but where would you start? How do we know what to start with? Well, it's been proposed that there are basically roughly five great texts that we can build our classical education upon, and I'm going to list these for you and kind of explain them to you a little bit. The Iliad and the Odyssey by Homer. And these are the books that the Greeks used. They used them to really express who the ideal man was. Do you ever hear that term used anymore in your circles? Do you talk about the ideal man? No, I think we've kind of said, oh, there's not an ideal man. But the Greeks believed there was an ideal man, and the individuals really could try to approximate the idea of an ideal man. So by reading these books, the Iliad and Odyssey, we can actually examine that. What could the ideal man look like? The Aeneid by Virgil. So we're moving into the Roman period here. The Romans were really heavy on family. So we want to see how this text embodies the values of the Roman culture. We want to learn from them as well. And then a third book that we read, and these are read in ninth grade, but the third book that we read here is The Divine Comedy by Dante. And that's really an articulation of the values of Christian education. So you see, we looked at the Greeks, we looked at the Romans. Now we're looking at the Christian perspective here, and that idea of the idea of an ideal man from a Christian perspective. And then the plays of Shakespeare, very worthy of reading. They show us all kinds of characters, good and bad. And then, of course, the Bible. And I've heard it said that it would be worthy of us to read the Bible in the King James Version, even if for nothing else than just the beauty of the language, to be able to understand the linguistic side of that. So, you might be asking, why the great books? Why would we really want to focus on these great books and not just the modern literature? Well, the great books embody the spirit of the West and that spirit of inquiry. Mortimer Adler, in that first volume of the Great Books series, says, to put an end to the spirit of inquiry that has characterized the West, it's not necessary to burn books. All we have to do is leave them unread for a few generations. All we have to do is leave them unread. Well, let me just ask by a show of hands, how many of you have read all those books that's on the list? And notice my hand is down. Few. Wow. Look around the room for just a minute. There were, what, five? Hold your hands up, sorry. You should be proud of that. All right. Wow. How many of you want to read those? I do. Okay, the great books. They hold the habitual vision of greatness. Sir Richard Livingston said, we are tied down all our days, and for the greater part of our days, to the commonplace. That is where contact with great thinkers, great literature helps. In their company, we are still in the ordinary world, but it is the ordinary world transfigured and seen through the eyes of wisdom and genius, and some of that vision becomes our own. Don't we want that for our children? Don't we want that for us, to have some of that greatness of our founding fathers, or even going back to some of that greatness of Socrates and Plato? So the great books embody the spirit of the West, the spirit of inquiry. They also provide the grammar of virtue. We have to begin to orient our affections. And we can do that through the accumulation of patterns found in these books. We can't make virtuous decisions until our affections are oriented. So we're going to orient our affections through these great books. C.S. Lewis wrote in The Abolition of Man, kind of a long quote here. I'm sorry, I don't have all these quotes for you. Aristotle says that the aim of education is to make the pupil like and dislike what he ought. Make the pupil like and dislike what he ought. He goes on to say, when the age for reflective thought comes, the pupil who has been thus trained in ordinate affections or just sentiments will easily find the first principles in ethics, but to the corrupt man they will never be visible at all, and he can make no progress in that science. Plato, before Aristotle, said the same. He said the little human animal will not at first have the right responses. It must be trained to feel pleasure, liking, disgust, and hatred at those things which are really pleasant, likable, disgusting, and hateful. Let me read that last little part again. Plato said, the little human animal will not at first have the right responses. It must be trained to feel pleasure, liking, disgust, and hatred at those things which really are pleasant, likable, disgusting, and hateful. And it's through the great books that we see examples of these. The great books also provide a systematic study of cultures. So that focuses in the rhetoric stage is on ideas rather than facts. And the study of the great books allows the past to speak for itself. It combines history, it combines writing, philosophy, politics, and ethics from the Western civilization. It combines them all into this seamless whole. And the goal of the rhetoric stage is a greater understanding of our own civilization, country, and place. So we go back and we study history. We look at Athens. Why do we look at Athens? Why do we look at the Greeks? Because they are so known for their philosophy. Every good and bad example of man can be found in these works. We're going to move on to Rome, study the culture of Rome, because they were very pragmatic. Look at all that they have left to us. So we want to understand that. And then Jerusalem. Why would we say Jerusalem? For that spiritual side, how God deals with man. And all of these models can be found in the great books, and they actually build towards the Christian paideia, which is just the Christian child rearing. So I'm going to summarize why we have the great books with a quote. Do you have my book? Sorry. This is a quote by Sir Richard Livingston. He was a British classical scholar and university administrator, and it's from an essay he wrote called A Defense of Classical Education, written in 1917. I'm sorry, give me just a minute to find this. I left this laying on my desk. Okay. Sorry. Okay, here it is. Okay, it's a little long, so bear with me. So he says, one of the chief objects of education is to train flexibility of mind, to make a man quick to comprehend other points of view than his own. Obviously, no power is more necessary in dealing with men. To be able to discard for the moment his own opinions and see the world through the eyes of other classes, races, or types is as indispensable to the merchant as to the statesman. For men are hardly to be controlled or influenced unless they are understood. And yet, no power is rarer. It is almost non-existent among uneducated people. A man who has not risen above the elementary school is hardly ever able to seize an attitude of mind at all different to his own. He may acquiesce in it because he trusts or respects the character of the person in question, but he does not understand it. He cannot perform the great feat for which our intellectual gymnasia train us, of being in two or more people's skins at the same time. And this is not due to the absence of any organ from his body, but simply to the fact that he has never practiced the art. Nor is the failing confined to the quite uneducated. We all of us spend half of our time in misunderstanding our neighbor. And in most controversies, misunderstanding is the dividing line between the parties concerned. Now, the power of sympathetic insight is trained by a literary education. A man learns above all from the study of literature and history to put himself in the place of other men, races, and times, to identify himself with them, to see what they mean and how they felt. And so, by continual practice, he becomes quick at seizing the views of other people than himself, seeing what is in their mind and accommodating himself to it. And that's why we use the great books as the source for our virtue. Okay, so we've used that definition from the Iliad to understand that classical education is both wisdom and virtue. How do we go about wisdom? We go about that through the 7 liberal arts, namely the trivium, the grammar, logic, and rhetoric. How do we go about virtue? We go about that through the great books and through the integration of literature and history. So let's talk for just a minute about how this can look different from a typical education that you could receive in public school or even private school. I'm going to label this as progressive education because that's really what's happening mostly in our schools now. So let's look just briefly. I probably should have had these reversed. But so we have classical liberal arts education. You can understand that we're drawing on the common humanity. When you're reading these great books, you're studying these, you are trying to understand what is it that's interwoven through all of humanity. It's virtue, it's truth. It's all of these big ideas. But in progressive education, we often focus on the individual, especially there's been movements about, how do you think, how do you feel, who are you? It's a focus on the individual. In the classical liberal arts, we guide the children toward the ideal man. Does God have an ideal man? Do we know what we're wanting our kids to grow up to be? But in the progressive education, it's often child-centered towards self-discovery. In classical liberal arts education, there's an integration of subjects. Now we do, even in our School of Logic and School of Rhetoric, they do go to math class and history class and science class. Unfortunately, we wish we couldn't do that. But we've actually even taken the bell system out. We don't ring the bell because we don't want that just clear distinction between classes. But all of this is interwoven. Our literature is used even in math class. They can be reading about the great mathematicians. They're writing in math class. They're writing in science class. So we want to integrate all subjects. But in the progressive education, it really is subject-centered and compartmentalized. I don't know about you, but I tell this that it was college before I even realized, wow, all these can kind of come together. Makes sense. But I didn't know that. So the classical liberal arts education, our aim is wisdom and virtue. We want our children to be good people. We want them to be the good man speaking well, the good man in their heart speaking well. It's that wisdom and that virtue. But in progressive education, the aim is often vocational. That's really the focus, is where will you go to college, and what will be your vocation after that. Okay, let's move on. I actually presented this session at NAUMS, which is the National Association of University Model Schools. I presented that last week. And so this is the presentation I gave. And so I moved on to the next slide, and I was speaking to educators then. And so I wanted to allow them to evaluate themselves and to evaluate their school. And I thought about taking this out for y'all today, and I thought, no, y'all are co-teachers, right? You need some professional development too, so you can evaluate yourself, even as a co-teacher, or we can talk about it as our school as well. So let's see how we're doing. So we talked about the major components of wisdom and virtue, and that definition to train you in all excellence of speech or thought and action. So if that's really important to us, how are we doing with it? Our schools are, I'm sorry, 1 minute, please. So if we're really focusing on wisdom and virtue, are our schools, is our school Veritas, or are you at home, really focusing on wisdom and virtue by teaching thinking skills? Do we encourage them here at school? Do you encourage them at home to use those thinking skills of collecting information, accumulating it, evaluating it, and expressing it? Are we focusing on virtue by helping them to understand what's true, good, and beautiful, to value that? Or do we simply just present content at all levels? I'm going to tell you, no, we don't do that here, especially in School of Rhetoric. We are geared towards this. We are geared towards helping them to see what's true, good, and beautiful. And you're going to see that from Troy in just a few minutes. So is our instruction of literature and history for the purpose of virtue? So when you're reading a book with your child, or when we're reading literature here at school, are we just focused on analyzing it? Or are we helping them to see virtue and wisdom in that? Are our classes, if we really are valuing the characteristics of classical education, language-based, history-driven, systematic, integrated, and rigorous, are our classes language-based enough? These are questions we'll be asking our teachers as we go through in-service in a couple weeks. Are we language-based enough? Where are the great books? Well, they are in the School of Rhetoric. We know that for sure. But we now see, too, that we can bring them even down lower. Not all those great books, but we can bring sort of some junior great books down. We do that a little bit. In first grade, they read The Trojan Horse, a little simple little book. In fifth grade, they used to read the children's Homer. I'm thinking maybe we need to bring that back in so they can see these little books. They read I don't know if they read Pilgrim's Progress, but that's a great book for them to read. So in third grade, we read The Little Pilgrim's Progress. And there's even a picture book. It's called The Dangerous Journey. So can we bring these books in at a lower level to get them to start understanding that wisdom and virtue and get them ready for these great books? So is history being taught systematically and interwoven into other subjects? I can tell you that's what we do and what we're trying to do better. As I said, even being able to read a math class about the mathematicians, in science, to study the history of science, which we do. Are reading, writing, and thinking skills seamlessly integrated in all subjects? Be looking for this. When your students are coming home doing assignments, ask yourself these questions. Is this happening? So if we embrace the idea of teaching skills through the trivium, are our teaching pedagogies, our manners, appropriate for each level? For example, if we're a grammar school teacher, my first or second grade, third grade teachers, are they expecting critical thinking, or are they focusing on providing a feast of information? When I was teaching first grade back in the early 90s, I was evaluated on that. How much time was I spent on teaching my first graders critical thinking? I look back at that now and I think, wow, what were they thinking about? I don't know that they had anything to think about because I hadn't given them any grammar. right? You have to have something to think about. So why are we asking them to do a logical skill at a first or second grade level? But if you're a high school teacher or your high school students, are they just focusing on the grammar? Or are these teachers and are you encouraging them to dig deeper and to articulate what they're thinking? Let me just ask you this question. How many of you hated or strongly disliked history when you were in high school? Okay, at least a third of us maybe, right? How many of you absolutely loved it? A few, okay. All right, so if you think that if you disliked history, could it be perhaps that your teacher was teaching at a grammar level in high school, that the focus was on the dates, was on that grammar part? Did you get to those deep questions? Did you get to really analyze and get into the good part of why this happened? Probably not. So we want to make sure that we're keeping them engaged by diving into those big ideas. So why is a classical education important today? Why are we focusing on developing these skills of thinking, these grammar, logic, and rhetoric? Why are we wanting wisdom and virtue? Well, there are many great reasons, but I'm going to just close with just a little, tiny little story. We were taking Caleb, our senior, on college trips this summer, and at one school we had the honor of being able to speak with an economics professor, and he happened to be the husband to the president of that college. And we enjoyed visiting with him for about an hour or so. And he made a really good point about what he expects of his students there and why it's so important for kids to come into college being able to think. And he said, kids have these devices in their hands all the time. They have smartphones all the time. And he said, in my classes, I can ask them a basic question, a grammar question. And he said in 15 seconds, they can have the answer. It's at the touch of their finger, right? Information is out there. It is so readily accessible to us now. You don't have to go to the library to an encyclopedia. You can find it right there. But he said, so I don't need to be asking those questions. They don't need to be memorizing all that. It's there. But they have to know how to think. They have to be able to think. You can't make this thing think. They have to think and they have to express. And so that's what our focus needs to be, is on growing up that good man speaking well and being able to articulate what he believes. So thank you for listening to that. If this kind of whets your appetite for what classical education is, Troy's going to give you even more right now. He's going to really help you to bring this to your home. And then I really encourage you to just keep an eye out for the notices and the memos this year and come to as many classes as you can so you will know how you can help apply this in your home.